In The End of Faith, you chide scientists who believe that consciousness ends with death. So, picking up a little bit on what David said, you wrote, the place of consciousness in the natural world is very much open to question. The truth is we simply do not know what happens after death. To my mind, this very much leaves the door open for a belief in the afterlife.
Yeah, although it doesn't make the traditional beliefs in the afterlife any more plausible. It's not the point I was making there, but it does, that point of not knowing what happens after death is what worries me about this conversation. I've been very worried about this, that all of you have given up a perfectly serviceable Tuesday evening only to hear the four of us tell you every which way that we have no idea what happens after death. Well, I expressed this fear to my wife, and she was actually able to put me at ease. I'm worried, obviously, about boring all of you, and she said, "Nothing Hitchens does is ever boring." So I have that going for me. Right. I think we should think about what this concept of the afterlife does. We'll talk about the plausible versions of it and how implausible some of the traditional ones are. But I think, just to give some context, we're living in a world in which 9 million children every year die before they reach the age of 5. Okay, year after year after year. I mean, that is an Asian-style tsunami of the sort you remember from 2004 every 10 days. Killing only children before the age of 5. I mean, think about these children, think about their parents. Know that virtually all of these parents are people who believe in God and were praying all the while that their children would be saved. And their prayers were not answered. Now, the afterlife comes into the midst of this reality. And as a promise that all of this is going to make sense in the end, that somehow at the end of existence we are going to be all let in on the punchline and have a mighty laugh with Almighty God for eternity. Now, there's no evidence of that, and I think, therefore, this concept of the afterlife really functions as a substitute for wisdom. It functions as a substitute for really absorbing our predicament, which is that everyone is going to die. There are circumstances that are just catastrophically unfair. Evil sometimes wins, and injustice sometimes wins. And the only justice we're going to find in the world is the justice we make. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to absorb this really down to the soles of our feet. And this notion of an afterlife, the happy talk about how it's all going to work out and it's all part of God's plan, is a way of shirking that responsibility. So that's where I am.
That consciousness may indeed survive.
Well, there are many odd ways in which consciousness could survive, and you can make a philosophically respectable argument that consciousness could survive the death of the brain. It's by no means the majority opinion in neuroscience or philosophy that it would. For instance, there's a philosopher at Oxford, Nick Bostrom. This is one of the weirder arguments, but still more plausible than the arguments you get from religion. Nick, there's actually very little you have to assume to make this seem somewhat robust. The argument is called the simulation argument, and he argues that we are all very likely not living in a real universe, but living in a simulated universe. And we are being simulated on the hard drives of computers of the future. Now, he gets there with a few simple steps. You simply have to acknowledge that consciousness is, at bottom, the result of information processing at the level of the brain. And there's nothing magical about brains. It could be information processing in a computer of the future. Most scientists think that's true. They don't think there's anything magical about the wet stuff in our heads. and that consciousness is at some point going to be instantiated in computers. Then you simply have to grant that humans of the future will run simulations of the past in the way that we run simulations, Sims games, and then there's just one short move, that simulated universes, almost by definition, will outnumber real universes. And therefore, we are a lot more likely to be among the simulated ancestors than the real ancestors. Now, again, everyone acknowledges it seems a little crazy, but the assumptions that you have to take on board are not so weak. And I would add to this the somewhat disconcerting idea that if, in fact, we are running as a simulation on a computer of the future, this computer could have been built by Mormons or Scientologists who would want to simulate the truth of their religion. And therefore, all religions could be true in this simulated universe. And we could expect to see Jesus coming back on clouds of glory and moving to Missouri as the Mormons expect. So now all of that sounds completely crazy, but it is not as crazy as the version of the afterlife that is really on offer traditionally, which has been actually neatly sidestepped here because it entails the resurrection of the dead. Most people think that the afterlife religion is offering, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has something to do with the soul floating off the brain into a tunnel of light and into paradise. But that's actually not the canonical afterlife. The canonical afterlife is God has to do the humble work of reassembling us. And I don't want to take more than my allotted time here, but I think we should talk about just how implausible that vision is, because that actually is the vision of Judaism and Christianity and Islam.
I just want to make some facts.
Wait a minute.
No, wait.
Dave, I'll give you your time here, please.
Okay.
That's the move that's really not open to you. If you want to change the subject to a truly purified wisdom tradition that is non-dogmatic, that's just open to mystery, you have to...
No, I'm not going to do that.
Okay, but if you want to follow the path...
You have to hear the move before you repudiate.
No, but I think you're taking the move that Bradley...
You think so, but I might not be.
Well, let me just tell you what I heard you do.
Okay, go ahead.
You just said religion is not the way Christopher suggested it was, and in the vast majority of cases, it is. And so you have to at least admit that we are not caricaturing religion. 50% of Americans think they're going to see their pets in heaven. I mean, we're dealing.
It wouldn't be heaven if you don't.
Right. We're having this conversation in the context of
now?
how religion is practiced.
Soon?
Yes.
Okay.
In response. I just want to kind of show you all how the sausage of faith gets made, or at least argued for. I see two problems with what you just did, and perhaps you're aware of them. One is that Maimonides actually said that this could not be understood allegorically or in any other way, but literally he came back 25 years later after he had been misunderstood in the Guide to the Perplexed and wrote, I think in his commentary to the Mishnah, that the resurrection is a literal truth, has to be believed in. There may be some caveats there in his theology, but he was talking about bodies being reanimated. The other issue is you made this sort of artful move to the free will loophole. You said people have free will. If a man wants to lock his daughter in a dungeon and have sex with her, God has allowed that because he's given us this rather diabolical freedom. That doesn't cover all of the other suffering for which only God can be responsible if he exists. The 9 million children I just talked about dying every year through cancers and violence and accidents and lack of access to clean water. And this is God's fault if God exists. I mean, either he can do nothing about this, or he doesn't care to. So either he's impotent or evil. I mean, this is the problem that the free will doesn't get you out of.
David and Brad, I wanted to pick up on that point in the context of this afterlife issue, which is, if you believe in a just God, how could you not believe in a world to come where the good are the good receive benefits and the evil are punished.
Look, the challenge here is everyone has great clarity in the God they don't believe in. And I don't believe in that God either. Right? So,
Well, then what's God? But so how do you tell us how you understand gratuitous misfortune visited upon the innocent?
like being in a debate like this.
Oh. My condolences. There's some confusion here. I think there's a real asymmetry between science and religion that shouldn't go unobserved. And there's an effort on the part of David and Bradley to not own the very clear propositional claims that have been made by every religion for millennia. Claims about the way the universe is structured. Very explicit claims about what's going to happen in the future, about what happened in the past, about what happens after death. And these claims are incompatible. So, for instance, if Buddhism is true, Buddhism purports to be true. Buddhism has a doctrine of karma and rebirth. You can be reborn as an animal. You can be reborn in various realms. If Buddhism is true, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are absolutely false in their core claims. I mean, these are not pictures that can be squared logically. And every religion is in the business of making these claims about the afterlife and about all manner of other things. And the crucial difference between religion and science is that every religion is beholden to its literature and doesn't think, for the most part, apart from the fringe of kind of liberal intelligentsia, for the most part, people don't think it's man-made. They don't think that these are just books. If everyone read the Bible like Shakespeare, Hitch and I would be doing something entirely unrecognizable right now. I mean, there would be no problem. And so the problem we're articulating is everyone has this idea that they have knowledge about the afterlife, the end of days, the virgin birth of certain people, etc. And these are claims to truth, and they are profoundly anti-scientific because you can't edit the books. You can't edit the Quran. You can't edit the Bible. You can't acknowledge freely within the context of the faith that there are just mountains of life-destroying nonsense in these books, and that's a problem. I would just add one thing. This kind of question is still scientifically tractable. Reasonably serious people have tried to study the near-death experience, and this idea of consciousness somehow rising, dissociating from the body and rising to a point above the operating theater and looking down on the body, the phenomenology there is common enough that people seem to think that this is testable, and so some people have put random number generators on the top of cabinets in the operating theater, just on the odd chance that someone comes back saying, I saw this weird digital readout, above your cabinets, and it was, 35721. That would be very interesting. Now, no one, to my knowledge, has done that. But this is something we could set up this experiment in advance. It wouldn't be merely anecdotal.
Have they put shoes up there? Because sometimes that...
Well, it's obviously structured along the same lines. But again, there's a reason why we can't make a research program based on that one shoe.
It's about as good
as
as the people.
It's testable, and there's no data there. I mean, there's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain, or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact. They just can't get the words out. Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain, and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another, and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now,
David?
And I think a much more important point is if everything you're saying about your religious orientation is true, because you're basically confessing a kind of scientific attitude toward the mysteries of subjectivity and what happens after death, then the usefulness of holding to these traditions and these first century books is I'm completely at a loss. I mean, it seems like you're in the wrong line of work. You should be psychology. Well, it's to some degree an artifact of Judaism. I mean, this is not a problem that Christopher and I run into with evangelicals and Muslims. I mean, it is conceivable to be a Jew and be even and a serious Jew, someone who takes their Judaism very seriously, and be even less religious than you are, and to say you don't believe in God, and that is just a frank contradiction within Christianity and Islam at the moment, and it was a frank contradiction certainly at some point in Judaism, and certainly Maimonides seemed to think it was. I think we can concede, however, that that belief in the afterlife, or at least a profession of belief in the afterlife, gives you something to say in the most difficult moments in life to others who are losing someone or who have lost someone. It gives you something to say that an atheist doesn't have, which, if believed by the one who has just lost their child, for instance, is really consoling. I mean, there is nothing better in terms of consolation than to believe that the child you just lost is now someplace perfect and you will be reunited.
Sam, what would you say? I mean, put yourself on the spot. If somebody in that moment asked you, I'm about to die, what's going to happen to me? What would you tell them?
Well, I mean, I think actually this issue of the one who dies is less... Our fear of death, at least as far as I can tell from a sample of one, is not of our own death. And we all go to sleep every night and just disappear. We lose everything. I mean, deep sleep for almost everyone is synonymous with oblivion. I mean, you lose your sensory experience, you forget your life. If you never woke up, you wouldn't notice it. And this is... Many people have noticed this, perhaps most famously the Roman poet Lucretius. If death is synonymous with non-existence, there really is nothing to fear, and slipping into it may feel just as satisfying as slipping into sleep. I mean, there's just that's not what we're worried about. We're worried about the process of dying, perhaps, I mean, the process of being ill and in pain, and we're really worried about losing the people we love while we're alive, and having nothing to think that's consoling in the midst of that bereavement. I think we're talking slightly at cross purposes here. I'm talking about unconsciousness, just the absolute cessation of any kind of experience. If the prototypical atheist is right, and you just get a dial tone at death, that is what people claim to fear, but as Lucretius pointed out, that is analogous to the time before your birth. You'll no more suffer the eternity after your death than you'll suffer the time before your birth. And I mean, there was a time where we're sitting was populated entirely by, I think, Chumash Indians. None of us were here. Okay, now what was that like? Not for the Chumash, for us.
I
It
will
didn't
say.
bother me.